Imagine, just for a moment, that the world around you has gone quiet. The electric hum of modern life fades away, replaced by the deep, resonant thud of a heavy hammer on warm iron. You are standing in the doorway of a small, stone workshop at the edge of a sleeping village. The air here is different, thicker, warmer, smelling faintly of charcoal and old oak. It is a place of shadow and fire, where time is measured not by clocks, but by the slow cooling of metal. Hey, the heat isn't an enemy, it is a companion. It wraps around you like a heavy blanket, protecting you from the biting winter wind outside. We are going to step inside this sanctuary of soot and silence to see how these craftsmen lived, how they worked, and how they found a quiet rhythm in the heart of the fire. So, find a comfortable place to rest your head. Let your shoulders drop. Let the imaginary warmth of the forge reach you, softening the tension of the day. Tonight, we are not here to fight battles or forge swords for war. We are here to mend the plow and shew the gentle May. We are here to watch the sparks rise and fade, drifting upward into the dark rafters like tiny, fleeting stars. Breathe in slowly. Can you smell the iron? Can you feel the radiant heat? The village is asleep. The only light for miles is the soft orange glow of the hearth in front of you. The smith is tired, but his hands are steady. He moves with a slowness that only comes from years of practice. Listen to the fire breathe. Hoo, hoo. There is nowhere else you need to be. The work is almost done. Just you, the warmth, and the quiet history of the blacksmith's night. But before we dive in, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a small gesture that truly helps the channel grow, and I'm always curious to know where in the world you're listening from, and at what time of night. The world before dawn in the medieval countryside was not merely dark. It was a heavy, absolute presence. If you were to stand in the center of the village at this hour, wrapped in your cloak against the biting chill, you would hear almost nothing. There were no engines humming in the distance, no street lamps buzzing with electricity, only the immense, suffocating silence of a world waiting for the sun. The stars above would be piercingly bright, indifferent and cold, looking down on the thatched roofs that huddled together like sleeping sheep. For the blacksmith, this hour of silence was his private domain. His body knew the time without the need for a bell, while the rest of the village, the farmers, the weavers, the children, remained lost in the depths of their first sleep. Drifting in that peaceful interval before the day truly began, the smith was already stirring. He would wake slowly, sliding out from beneath a pile of heavy woolen blankets and sheepskins. The air inside the cottage would be frigid, the kind of cold that stiffened the joints and made the simple act of breathing feel sharp. He would move quietly, a ghost in his own home, his feet finding the familiar rough-hewn floorboards in the dark. He did not light a candle yet. Tallow was expensive, and he knew every knot in the wood, every low beam that might graze his head. He would pull on his tunic, the linen cold and stiff against his skin until his body heat began to soften it. Then came the hose, thick and woolen, and finally his boots, leather worn soft by years of use, cracking at the creases but still steady. He would pause for a moment, perhaps to whisper a quick, silent prayer into the darkness, thanking God for the strength in his arms and the rest in his bones. Stepping out of the cottage, the transition to the outside air was a physical shock. The door would creak on its iron hinges, hinges he had likely forged himself years ago, and he would step into the courtyard. The ground was hard with frost, crunching softly under his weight. The smithy was usually a separate structure, standing apart from the living quarters to keep the danger of fire at bay. It loomed ahead of him in the darkness, a squat, stone building with a wide door and a chimney that stood like a sentry against the starry sky. As he walked those few dozen steps, his breath clouded in the air, a white plume vanishing into the gray morning mist. There was a profound sense of isolation in this walk. He was the first soul awake, the guardian of the village's fire. When he pushed open the heavy wooden door of the workshop, the smell would hit him instantly. It was the scent of his life, a complex, grounding perfume of old coal dust, iron filings, dry earth, and the faint, acrid ghost of yesterday's sulfur. It was a dry smell, distinct from the damp earthiness of the farm. Inside, the shop was pitch black, a cave of secrets. He would walk to the center of the room, navigating by touch. His hand would brush against the cold, smooth horn of the anvil, the massive iron altar in the center of the room. It was freezing to the touch now, a silent beast waiting to be woken. His first task was always the same: the fire. In the medieval world, fire was a living thing that had to be cared for. Starting a fire from scratch with flint and steel was a tedious, frustrating chore, especially with cold, numb fingers. A wise smith never let the fire truly die. The night before, he would have banked the coals, piling them together in a tight mound and covering them with a thick layer of gray ash. This starved the fire of oxygen, putting it into a deep, smoldering sleep without extinguishing it completely. Now, in the dark, he gently scraped back the ash with a small iron rake. He searched for the seed of the fire, and there it was, a dull, faint cherry-red glow in the center of the hearth. It was weak, barely alive, but it was enough. He would lean in close, his face illuminated by that tiny, fragile light, and blow gently. Woo! The glow would brighten, responding to his breath. He would add a handful of kindling, dried shavings of ash wood or perhaps some dry moss he had gathered, and then, carefully, small nuggets of charcoal. The fire would crackle, a sharp, friendly sound in the silence. As the flames began to lick upward, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls, the workshop would slowly reveal itself. The racks of tongs, the hammers of various weights, the chisels, all waiting in their places, touched by the new warmth. He would not rush this moment. There was no customer waiting yet, no horse stamping at the door. He would simply stand there for a minute, warming his hands over the growing flame, tanning his palms to the heat. He was the only man awake in the world, or so it felt. The fire was his companion, and together they would face the day. He would take a piece of hard bread from his pocket, perhaps breaking his fast while staring into the coals, mentally preparing for the rhythm of the hammer that would soon drown out the quiet. But for now, there was only the soft hiss of the burning wood and the slow retreating of the dark. With the fire now awake, it needed to breathe. A fire left to its own devices would burn lazily, fit only for warming a pot of soup or drying wet boots. But the blacksmith needed more. He needed a heat that could turn solid iron into something as soft as clay. He needed a dragon's breath. This is where the bellows came in. In the shadowy corner of the forge, mounted near the hearth, sat the great lungs of the workshop. They were massive, often as tall as a man, constructed from oak ribs and supple oxhide leather. They looked like a giant accordion, or perhaps the folded wings of a great bat resting against the wall. The smith would reach up and grasp the handle. A smooth, polished piece of ash would worn down by the grip of his father and his grandfather before him. He would pull. Creak. The leather would expand, drawing in the cool, dusty air of the shop. Then, he would push or release the lever, allowing the weight of the upper board to compress the lungs. Whoosha! The air was forced through a metal pipe called the tuyere, pronounced tway, and directly into the heart of the coals. The effect was instant. The fire didn't just get brighter, it roared. The lazy yellow flames turned intense and focused, shifting to a blinding white-hot center that seemed almost liquid in its intensity. The sound of the bellows was the heartbeat of the smithy. It wasn't a constant noise, but a rhythmic one. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. It was a slow, steady cadence that you could almost breathe along with, a mechanical respiration that mirrored the smith's own steady breath. For an apprentice, operating the bellows was often the first job they learned. It looked simple, just pulling a lever up and down, but it required a deceptive amount of skill. Pump too fast, and you'd burn through your precious charcoal in an hour, wasting the fuel that had taken days to prepare. Pump too slow, and the iron would cool and harden before the master could shape it, leading to cracks and flaws. It was a meditation. You had to listen to the fire, to hear its hunger. You had to watch the color of the flames. Blue meant it was too cold, white meant it was too hot, and a rich, bright yellow was just right. The apprentice would stand there for hours, eyes fixed on the coals, drifting into a trance state where the only thing that mattered was the rhythm of the lever. The leather of the bellows had a smell of its own, musty, animalistic, and dry. It required care, just like the tools. If the leather cracked, the air would escape, and the fire would weaken. So, on slow days, or perhaps during the quiet lulls of a rainy afternoon, the smith would rub tallow or neatsfit oil into the folds, keeping the skins soft and airtight. He would check the valves, simple leather flaps that acted like heart valves, opening to let air in and slamming shut to force it out. Sometimes, these valves would make a soft thwomp sound, a dull heartbeat inside the machine. As the smith worked the bellows this morning, the shop began to truly wake up. The chill of the dawn retreated into the corners, chased away by the growing radius of heat. The light from the forge grew powerful enough to illuminate the soot-stained rafters, where generations of spiders had spun webs that were now coated in black dust, looking like intricate lace made of shadows. The rhythm of the breath, creak, whoosh, creak, whoosh, signaled to the village that the day had begun. The forge was alive. The lungs were pumping. And in the center of the fire, the first bar of iron was beginning to change. It shed its cold, gray skin, first blushing a dull red, then deepening to cherry, and finally blooming into a radiant, living orange. The metal was no longer just a rock. It was becoming something alive, ready to be shaped by the will of the smith. The anvil had been there longer than anyone could easily remember, a dark, steady shape at the very heart of the forge, as constant as the rising of the sun and as dependable as the path worn between village well and field. It did not move, it did not speak, but it gathered the whole day around itself, quietly collecting every footstep, every breath of the bellows, every drifting thought of the blacksmith who stood before it. In the soft, early light of the kindled fire, when the coals were only just beginning to glow a deep, living orange, the anvil looked almost like a small, sleeping hill of iron, waiting for the first touch that would wake it. In most village smithies, the anvil was the unquestioned center of gravity, set on a solid stump or block of oak buried deep into the earth so that every blow would sink down into the ground instead of wasting itself in a hollow ring. It stood where the blacksmith could reach it in a single step from the fire, so that the moment a bar of iron left the coals, still glowing and soft, it could be laid on the anvil's face before the heat fled and the metal stiffened again. The anvil's top surface, known as the face, was its delicate skin, flat and resilient, sometimes steel-faced over a body of softer iron, carrying a faint sheen where thousands of hammer strokes had polished it without ever fully erasing its scars. When the blacksmith took up the first piece of iron for the day, drawing it from the heart of the coals with a pair of long tongs, the metal glowed a rich orange yellow, its outline softened by the shimmer of the heat that quivered in the air around it. In that instant, the forge seemed to hold its breath. The fire hissed softly, the bellows rested, the apprentice watched. Then, with practiced ease, the smith laid the bar across the anvil's face, adjusted his grip, and raised the hammer. The first blow of the morning did not crash down like thunder. It fell in a measured, controlled arc, landing with a deep, rounded thunk that sank into the wood, the iron, and the earth, more felt in the chest than heard in the ears. Every part of the anvil had a purpose, and over years the blacksmith came to know its curves and corners as intimately as his own hands. The long, tapering horn at one end, smooth and rounded, was where he bent and curled iron into graceful arcs, hooks for hanging pots over the fire, rings for door latches, the gentle curve of a horseshoe that would later be refined. The flat face was where he drew metal out into thinner lengths, turning thick square bars into lean, useful rods, or broadening a blunt piece into the wide, flat shape of a plowshare that would bite the earth and open it for seed. Near one corner, a square hole, the hardy hole, waited to hold a variety of specialized tools, cutting blocks, swags, and fullers, each fitted in and out as needed, so the anvil could borrow new shapes and edges for a moment before returning to its simple, solid self. When the hammer found its rhythm, the anvil replied in its own quiet voice. In some workshops, where the anvil was set more loosely or the floor was hollow beneath it, the blows rang with a clear, bright note that could be heard far out into the street, a high peal that carried like a bell. In this village forge, the smith preferred a gentler sound, and so his anvil sat sunk deep into a stout block of oak set firmly into packed earth, the wood and soil swallowing the shrillness so that each stroke became a more muffled, steady thud, like a heartbeat heard through layers of cloth. The sound did not disturb the quiet of the morning so much as fold itself into it, marking time in a slow, dependable pattern. Thunk, pause, thunk, pause. Between blows, there were small, almost imperceptible pauses, where the smith adjusted his grip, or turned the bar of iron a quarter turn, or shifted it from face to horn to edge. These resting moments were as important as the strikes themselves, because in that short breath of time he could read the metal's changing color, feel its resistance through the hammer, and sense exactly when it had cooled too far and needed to return to the comfort of the fire. To an outside watcher, the whole process might have looked like a simple repetition, up, down, but in truth it was more like listening and answering. The anvil told him, with each vibration and each slight rebound, what the metal was willing to do. Around the anvil, the floor bore witness to years of this conversation. Directly beneath its overhanging edges, the packed earth was darker, impregnated with countless tiny splinters of iron that had flown away as scale when hot metal met air and hammer. Here and there, small curls of discarded offcuts lay half-buried in the dust, little twists of metal that had been snipped free through the hardy hole when a bar was too long, or when a horseshoe blank needed trimming. The smith would occasionally sweep the floor with a straw broom, but some of the tiny fragments always remained, sparkling faintly when a stray beam of sunlight found its way through the doorway. At different times of day, the anvil hosted different kinds of whack, each with its own tempo and mood. In the earlier hours of the morning, before customers arrived, the blacksmith often used his quieter time to whack on small, steady tasks that allowed him to slip into an almost meditative state, drawing out bars into slender rods for nails, flattening pieces for hinges, or shaping simple hooks. Making nails, in particular, was a kind of comfortable monotony. The same series of steps repeated over and over, each tiny length of iron heated, struck into a tapered point, cut, and then headed over a nail-making plate set into the hardy hole. The work might have seemed dull to an onlooker, but for the smith it was a way to let his thoughts drift quietly while his body followed a well-worn pattern. Later in the day, when a farmer arrived with a broken plowshare or a cracked hoe, the anvil's song changed just slightly. The pieces of damaged iron were laid upon its face, and the smith inspected every curve and crack, deciding whether the tool should be reforged, welded, or completely remade. The blows were heavier then, more purposeful. He might upset a distorted edge back into thickness, or weld on a new piece of iron where the old had worn away. Each stroke planned to restore strength without adding unnecessary weight. Behind each strike there was a quiet understanding that these tools would go back into the fields, back into the soil that fed the village, and so the anvil did its part in feeding everyone. On other days, the anvil might be used for finer, more delicate work that demanded a different sort of care. Small knives, household blades, buckles, or decorative hinges required a lighter hand. The smith might choke up on the hammer, holding it closer to the head, and let it fall with a more restrained touch that coaxed the shapes he wanted instead of forcing them. The anvil, still and solid, supported every detail. Tiny curves for a latch handle, the narrow spine of a blade, the graceful bend of a hook meant to hold a lantern by someone's cottage door. In these hours, the sound of the hammer softened, like someone speaking in a lower voice out of respect for the intricate work underway. When horses needed shoeing, the anvil became a place of living movement again. A straight bar of iron was heated, then brought to the anvil and bent slowly around its horn, the smith turning and taning the bar until it began to resemble the curve of a hoof. He judged size by eye and by the experience written into the memory of his hands. Each horse's foot was different, but after years of work the variations felt as natural as differences between faces in a crowd. The unfinished shoe, still glowing, would then be refined on the anvil's face, its ends shaped, nail holes punched, edges smoothed, until it was ready to be tested against the living hoof. For the apprentice, the anvil was both a teacher and a test. At first, there were permitted only small tasks there, holding metal steady while the master struck, or practicing light blows on cold scrap to learn control without risk. The master watched closely, listening not just to the pitch of the impact but to the pattern. Wild, uneven strokes betrayed impatience or lack of focus, while slow, regular ones hinted at a developing discipline. Over time, the apprentice would be allowed to try simple pieces, perhaps drawing out a nail, or shaping a small hook. Each success quietly celebrated not with applause, but with a nod and a slightly harder task next time. Outside the forge, the faint, muffled rhythm of iron on iron sometimes reached the ears of villagers as they went about their own routines, a familiar background music to daily life. Children might hear it as they fetched water, women as they repaired clothes or prepared meals, farmers as they checked harnesses and tools, and each would draw a quiet reassurance from its steadiness. The smith was at work, the anvil was singing, and the world, at least for that moment, remained in its proper order. On especially cold mornings, the sound drifted through the pale air like a slow, distant bell marking the passage of time, soft enough not to startle, steady enough to comfort. As the day wore on and the smith's body grew more tired, the anvil remained unchanged, its surface ready for the 1000th blow just as it had been for the first. When the fire finally began to bank down toward evening, the hammer strokes gradually spaced out, and the quiet around the anvil thickened again. Tools were put back in their places, the floor was given a leisurely sweep, and the last piece of metal was turned and examined one final time in the fading light. At last, when the smith laid his hammer down beside the anvil and rested his hand for a moment on its cooling face, it felt as if two old companions were saying goodnight without words, knowing they would meet again at the same place tomorrow, to sing the same slow, steady song. If you imagine yourself standing there now, in that peaceful dusk of the workshop, you can almost feel the faint warmth still lingering in the iron under your fingertips, the floor solid beneath your feet, and the soft echo of distant hammer strokes still floating somewhere in the rafters. The anvil is quiet again, but the memory of its rhythm continues, as gentle as a heartbeat heard through a pillow, inviting your own breathing to slow and match its patient pace. The fire in the smithy did not begin here, within these stone walls. Its true origin lay miles away, deep within the ancient, breathing silence of the forest, in a place where the canopy was so thick that the sun touched the ground only in dappled, shifting pools. To understand the heat that now warmed the blacksmith's face, one had to understand the ghosts of the trees that fueled it. The charcoal that filled the bins in the corner of the workshop was not merely burnt wood. It was a harvest, gathered with as much care and ritual as the wheat in the fields. It was the lifeblood of the forge, brought into existence by men who lived on the edges of the civilized world, the colliers, or charcoal burners. These men were often seen as mysterious figures by the villagers, living for months at a time in simple turf huts deep in the woods. Their work was a slow, smoky alchemy. They would cut the wood, often coppiced hazel, oak, or ash, during the dormant winter months when the sap was low. They stacked the logs with architectural precision into great conical mounds, sometimes 10 feet across, packing them tight to leave no gaps. Then they would cover the entire structure with a thick blanket of turf, wet straw, and earth, sealing the wood inside a dark, airless tomb. When they lit the fire at the center, the goal was not to burn the wood, but to cook it, to bake the moisture and impurities out of it, leaving behind only the pure, black soul of the carbon. This process could take days. The colliers would have to watch the mound day and night, listening to its internal rumbles, smelling the smoke to judge the progress. White smoke meant steam, the wood was drying. Blue smoke meant carbonization, the charcoal was forming. It was a delicate, dangerous dance. If the mound got too much air, it would burst into flames and turn to useless ash. If it had too little, the fire would die. Once the burn was finished and the mound had cooled, the harvest was raked out. What remained was lighter than stone but sounded like glass when it tumbled together. A crisp, metallic tick-tick-tick that was music to a blacksmith's ears. The journey of this fuel to the village was a ritual in itself. Every few weeks, a cart would rumble down the rutted track from the forest, pulled by a pair of patient oxen or a heavy workhorse. The cart was piled high with rough burlap sacks, each one bulging with the precious black lumps. The arrival of the charcoal cart at the smithy was a moment of quiet celebration. The blacksmith would often step out to greet the collier. They were men of two different worlds, one of the village and the iron, the other of the woods and the earth, but they shared a mutual respect. Without the collier, the smith's hammer would be silent. Without the smith, the collier's work would have no purpose. They would unload the sacks together. As they tipped the charcoal into the storage bin in the corner of the shop, the sound was unique, a cascading, chiming rush, like the sound of 1,000 dry leaves skittering across a stone floor, but heavier. The dust, coal dust, would rise in a fine, glittering cloud, settling on their skin and clothes. It wasn't a dirty feeling, though. Charcoal is clean, pure carbon. It didn't cling like grease or mud. It washed off easily, leaving the skin scrubbed and fresh. This fuel was superior to raw wood in every way. Wood contains water, sap, and oils. When it burns, it smokes and hisses, wasting energy boiling off its own moisture. But charcoal was already dead to the world of water. It was ready to give everything it had to the heat. When the smith raked it into his forge, it didn't smoke. It didn't pop. It simply glowed. It burned with a steady, intense ferocity that could melt sand into glass or iron into liquid. As the blacksmith looked at the fresh pile in his bin, he saw more than just fuel. He saw the patience of the forest. He saw the slow weeks of winter when the trees were cut, the sleepless nights of the colliers watching the smoke, and the long journey down the mountain. All of that time, all of that effort, was now stored here, waiting to be released in a single hour of brilliant, focused heat. It was a gift of concentrated time, ready to be transformed into a nail, a hinge, or a shoe. He would nod to the collier, perhaps offer him a coin or a cup of small beer, and watch as the car turned around, the empty sacks folded neatly on the back, disappearing once again toward the tree line. The cycle was complete. The forest had come to the forge. If you were to step into the blacksmith's workshop from the bright, unsparing light of a summer noon, you would stop, blinded for a moment, as if you had walked into a cave. But if you stood still and let your breathing slow, waiting for your eyes to adjust, you would find that the darkness of the forge was not empty. It was rich, textured, and protective, a heavy velvet cloak that wrapped around everything within the stone walls. This darkness was intentional. It was a tool, as vital to the smith as his hammer or his tongs. In a world without digital thermometers, the blacksmith read the heat of the iron with his eyes. He needed to see the subtle, shifting language of incandescence, the way a bar of steel would blush a dull, angry red, then brighten to the color of a ripe cherry, and finally bloom into a translucent, buttery yellow. If the shop were flooded with bright sunlight, these delicate colors would be washed out, bleached into invisibility. A piece of iron that looked black in the sun might still be hot enough to blister skin. But in the shadows of the forge, the metal whispered its true temperature. The darkness made the heat visible. It made the dangerous beautiful. Over the years, the workshop itself seemed to conspire to keep this darkness intact. Every surface in the room was coated in a fine, soft layer of soot. It was the inevitable fingerprint of the coal fire, a black dust that rose with the smoke and settled on the rafters, the walls, the shelves, and the tools. This soot was not like ordinary dirt. It was dry, light, and oddly soft to the touch. It clung to the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling until they looked like they were carved from ebony. It filled the cracks in the stone walls, smoothing out the roughness. It absorbed the light, drinking it in so that no reflection could distract the smith's eye. But more than that, the soot changed the sound of the room. Just as snow muffles the world outside, the layers of carbon dust inside the forge dampened the acoustics. The sharp ring of the hammer was softened. The hiss of the steam was hushed. The shop felt smaller than it was, closer, more intimate. It was a womb of industry, insulated from the sharp, clattering noises of the village street. In the corners of the room, where the firelight could not reach, the shadows were deep and secretive. The history of the forge was stored. There were piles of scrap iron, broken plowshares, bent nails, worn-out horseshoes, waiting for the day they might be reborn. They rusted quietly in the dark, their orange-brown oxidization blending with the shadows. There were tools, too, that hadn't been used in years. Strange, specialized tongs made by a grandfather for a job no one remembered, hammers with heads shaped for forgotten tasks. They hung on the walls like sleeping bats, shrouded in dust, watching the work continue. The apprentice learned quickly not to reach blindly into these dark recesses, not out of fear of ghosts, but out of respect for the sharp edges and heavy weights that lay hidden there. For the blacksmith, moving through this landscape of shadow and soot was second nature. He didn't need to see the handle of the sledgehammer to know where it leaned. His hand went to it automatically. He didn't need to check where the water trough was. He knew the cool breath of it on his arm as he passed. The darkness also created a unique sense of time. Outside, the sun moved across the sky, marking the hours with the shifting of shadows. But inside, the lighting remained constant, the steady, pulsing glow of the hearth. Morning, noon, and evening blurred together into a single, continuous flow of work. The only clock was the fire itself. Build it up, let it bang down, clean the slag, build it up again. It was a sanctuary. When the winter winds howled outside, rattling the shutters, the forge remained a warm, dark, and quiet place. The soot on the walls acted as insulation, keeping the heat in. The darkness felt cozy, like pulling a blanket over your head. It was a place where a man could be alone with his thoughts, where the simple, repetitive nature of the work allowed the mind to wander into a peaceful, dreamlike state. So, as the smith stood there, his face illuminated by the orange glow, he was not a man laboring in a dungeon. He was a master of the shadows. He lived in a world of his own making, a twilight kingdom where he controlled the sun and the coals and read the secrets of the iron in the dark. And in that quiet, soot-softened silence, he found a peace that the bright, noisy world outside could never offer. In the long, quiet hours of the morning, after the initial burst of heat had warmed the stone walls and before the first villagers arrived with their broken tools and impatient horses, the blacksmith often turned to his most fundamental task, the making of nails. It was work that many might consider tedious, a monotonous cycle of heating and hammering, but for the experienced smith, it was something else entirely. It was a rhythm, a form of meditation, a place where the mind could disconnect from the worries of the world and float on the repetitive current of muscle memory. Nails were the currency of construction in the medieval world. Every door, every wagon, every roof truss, every horseshoe required them. They were needed in the thousands, and there was no machine to spit them out. Every single nail, from the smallest tack to the largest spike, had to be born of fire and hand. This meant that a blacksmith's life was measured out in these small, iron increments. A good smith could forge a nail in a minute or two. A master could do it in seconds, a blur of motion that looked less like labor and more like a magic trick. The process began at the fire. The smith would take a long, slender rod of iron, nail rod, and thrust its tip into the heart of the coals. He didn't just put in one. He would often have 2 or 3 irons in the fire at once, cycling them through so that as soon as one was finished, the next was ready, glowing and waiting. It was a continuous loop, a circle of heat that never broke. When the iron was a bright, buttery yellow, he would pull it out. The transition to the anvil was fluid, a single sweeping motion. Tap, 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 tap. 4 blows. That was often all it took to taper the square end of the rod into a sharp point. He would turn the rod a quarter turn with his left hand between each strike, the hammer in his right hand falling with the regularity of a metronome. The sound was lighter than the heavy thuds of larger work, a crisp, clear ting-ting-ting that danced in the air. Then came the cut. He would lay the rod across a sharp chisel tool called a hardy, set into the anvil's hole. A light blow, and the metal was scored, cut almost all the way through but still hanging on by a thread of hot iron. Next was the header. This was a simple tool, a flat bar of steel with a hole in it. He would thrust the hot, pointed nail into the hole. The UN-tapered part of the rod would catch on the edges, holding the nail fast. With a quick twist of his wrist, he would snap the long rod free, leaving just the short, glowing stub of the nail sticking up from the header. Now, speed was everything. The metal was cooling fast, its color fading from yellow to orange to dull red. Bam, bam, bam. 3 or 4 hard, flat blows to the top of the stub flattened it out, creating the head. It might be a simple flat head for a board, or a facete rose head for a decorative door, shaped with angled strikes that left a pattern like a flower. Finally, he would turn the header over and tap the nail out. It would fall onto the growing pile on the floor or into a bucket of sand, sending up a tiny wisp of heat. Clink, the sound of a finished job. And then, without pausing, his hand would already be reaching back to the fire for the next rod, which was now perfectly hot. The cycle began again. There was a profound peace in this repetition. The smith didn't have to think about the geometry of the plow or the temperament of a horse. He didn't have to solve problems. He just had to be. Heat, taper, cut, head, release. Heat, taper, cut, head, release. It was a rhythm that synced with his breathing, with his heartbeat. The thoughts that might have troubled him, the cost of charcoal, the health of his children, the rumors of war in distant lands, would dissolve into the cadence of the hammer. The song of the nail was a lullaby for the anxious mind. It was a space where time stopped moving forward and instead moved in circles, round and round, smooth and unbroken. For the listener lying in bed, imagining this rhythm is hypnotic. You can hear the sounds in your mind, the breath of the bellows, the high ring of the taper, the dull thud of the header, the clink of the cooling iron. It is a reliable, predictable pattern, a mechanical heartbeat that tells you that the world is working as it should, that things are being built, one small, sturdy piece at a time. The water trough was the forge's quiet opposite to the fire, a long, dark pool of stillness set close enough to the anvil for quick work, yet far enough that stray sparks could not so easily find it. Where the hearth blazed and roared and shifted with every pull of the bellows, the trough simply waited, a wooden or iron-lined tub filled with cool water that caught the dim light in a soft, wavering reflection. To step from the glow of the coals to the shadow by the water was to step from the heart of a midsummer afternoon into the edge of a quiet, shaded stream, and in that coolness the blacksmith could rest his eyes, his hands, and sometimes even his thoughts. Many times each hour, a bar of iron would travel the short, carefully memorized path from the blazing heart of the forge, across the waiting face of the anvil, and finally down into the shadowed embrace of the trough. When the metal was ready, its color risen from dull red through cherry to a bright, almost honey yellow that only showed itself clearly in the dim of the shop, the smith would choose his moment and lower it into the water. There was always a small, anticipatory pause, a breath held between fire and water, and then came the whispering roar, a long, shivering hiss as the heat fled the iron in a cloud of white steam, rising like a soft curtain around the smith's hands and face. In that sound was everything: the day's work, the controlled violence of forging made suddenly gentle, the sharp edges and polished points being sealed into the cooling metal as the water wrapped around it. The trough was not only for hardening sharp edges, it was also a place of quiet correction and patience. When a tool came from the fire too hot and wild, threatening to warp under the hammer, the smith might give it only the briefest kiss of water, a quick dip and lift that sent up a puff of steam and drew just enough heat away to steady the metal without making it brittle. Sometimes he would hold a blade halfway into the water, watching the line between wet and dry creep along the steel as it cooled, creating a gentle gradient of hardness and toughness along its length, all judged by feel and by the shapes of the steam. Between these small acts, the trough also served in simpler ways. The smith dunked a rag into it to wipe down tools, swirled the broom in it before sweeping to keep the dust from rising, and splashed his face with its coolness on hot afternoons when the forge felt like the center of the sun. For the apprentice, the trough meant early morning trips to the village well with a yoke and buckets, the slush of water over the rims marking his slow progress back to the shop. Keeping it full was a quiet responsibility. Without enough water, nothing could be hardened, no tools could be cooled, and the day's rhythm would stutter and stumble. As he grew, the apprentice learned to read the trough just as he learned to read the fire, watching how the steam rose thick and angry when metal was plunged in too hot, how a softer, gentler mist meant the temperature was just right, and how a still surface with no hiss at all warned that the iron had already cooled too far on the way from the anvil. In their quieter moments, master and apprentice might sit side by side on the low edge of the tub, boots resting in the damp dust, talking in low voices or not talking at all, just listening to the distant sounds of the village while the last ripples faded from the water's skin. At the very end of the day, when the hearth had been banked and the anvil stood cool and silent, the trough was one of the last things the smith would visit. He might plunge a final hot tool in and watch the last swirl of steam drift up toward the soot-dark rafters, or simply trail his fingers through the water, feeling how the day's work had left it warmer than the night air. The safes, once bright with reflections of flame, would now mirror only a faint glow and, beyond the doorway, a sliver of sky tanning from indigo to black. As he stepped away, closing the door behind him, the trough settled back into stillness, its quiet, waiting presence a cool counterpoint to the sleeping coals, ready, like the smith himself, to begin again when morning came. By mid-morning, the character of the forge would often shift. The solitary rhythm of nail-making, which had filled the early hours with its crisp, metallic song, was interrupted by a new sound from the courtyard. The slow, heavy clip-clop of hooves on cobblestones and the low murmur of voices. The village was awake, and the blacksmith's most common and vital patient had arrived: the horse. Shoeing a horse was not merely a mechanical task, it was a relationship. In the medieval world, the horse was the engine of agriculture, the vehicle of travel, and the companion of labor. To the smith, these animals were not just livestock, they were individuals with personalities as distinct as the villages themselves. There was the nervous, skittish colt that needed a soothing hand, the tired, old plough horse that would lean its heavy weight against you if you let it, and the gentle mare, standing with her head low, eyes half closed, trusting the man with the hammer. The process began with a kind of quiet diplomacy. The smith would approach the animal slowly, speaking in a low, steady drone, a meaningless stream of soft words designed to calm the nerves. He would run a hand down the horse's shoulder, along the flank, and finally down the leg, asking permission before lifting the heavy hoof. Once the hoof was cradled between his knees, the work of the farrier began. It was an intimate, physical labor. The smith had to bend his body into an awkward curve, supporting the weight of the animal while leaving his hands free to work. First, he would use a hook-like tool called a hoof pick to clean out the mud and stones packed into the sole. Then, with a sharp knife, He would trim the overgrown horn of the hoof, paring away the dead material just as one might trim a fingernail. The sound was a soft scritch-scritch, a dry, organic noise distinct from the ringing of iron. The smell here was different, too. It was the scent of the stable, warm animal musk, sweat, and the earthy odor of the hoof trimmings. It was a living smell, pungent but not unpleasant to those who lived by the land. While the smith worked, the horse might shift its weight, blowing a soft breath through its nostrils that fluttered its lips, a pffft sound that signaled relaxation. The apprentice, standing by the horse's head, might stroke its nose or offer a handful of grain to keep it occupied, a silent partner in this delicate dance. Then came the fitting. This was the moment of fire and smoke that always drew the eyes of passing children. The smith would take the new shoe, heat it to a dull, non-glowing black heat, and press it briefly against the trimmed hoof to check the fit. Hiss! A thick cloud of white, acrid smoke would billow out instantly, smelling of burnt hair. To an observer, it looked painful, but the hoof is made of keratin, like a fingernail, and has no feeling in its outer layers. The horse would stand unmoved, perhaps twitching an ear at the sound but feeling no pain. The smith, squinting through the smoke, would check the bane pattern on the hoof. If the scorch mark was even all the way around, the shoe was flat and true. If not, it was back to the anvil for a few more taps. Finally, the nailing. This required the utmost precision. The nails had to be driven into the insensitive wall of the hoof, angling outward to exit the side without touching the sensitive quick inside. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was dull and solid. If the nail went in soft or the horse flinched, the smith knew he had erred and would withdraw it instantly. But with the gentle mare, the nails went in true, singing a rising pitch as they seated home. The ends of the nails were wrung off and clinched down, bent over so they couldn't pull out. A final rasp to smooth the edges, and the hoof was set down. Clop! A solid, new sound on the floor. The smith would straighten up, groaning slightly as he stretched his back, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a sooty forearm. He would pat the mare's neck, a gesture of thanks for her patience. The farmer would nod, a few coins would change hands, and the horse would be led away, her gait even and strong once more. For the listener, this scene offers a sense of grounded trust. It reminds us of a time when care was physical and tactile, when the safety of a journey depended on the skill of a neighbor's hands. The rhythmic scritch of the rasp and the dull tap of the nails are sounds of maintenance, of keeping the world moving, one hoof at a time. When the sun climbed to its highest point, hanging directly overhead like a polished brass shield in the sky, the village of the medieval world would slow its pace. The shadows, which had stretched long and thin in the morning, now retreated to hide directly beneath the cots and eaves, leaving the dusty streets bright and exposed. Inside the smithy, the change was felt not by the light, but by the heat. The forge had been running for hours, the stones of the hearth absorbing the fire's intensity until they radiated a solid, invisible wall of warmth that pushed against the smith's back. It was time to stop. The blacksmith would signal the break by driving his hammer into the stump of the anvil with a final, decisive thud. He wouldn't speak. The apprentice knew the signal well. Together, they would perform the small, silent ritual of pausing the work. The bellows were left to hang still, their leather lungs finally allowed to deflate. The fire was not extinguished. That would be a waste of good charcoal, but it was slacked. The smith would rake a layer of coal dust over the bright center, dimming its glare to a sleepy, sullen red, enough to keep the heart alive without consuming the fuel. Stepping out of the forge at midday was like surfacing from deep water. The air outside, though warm with the summer sun, felt thin and light compared to the dense, sulphurous atmosphere of the shop. The smith would squint against the brightness, his eyes adjusting from the orange gloom of the coals to the vibrant green of the village green and the blue of the sky. He would often take a seat on a rough wooden bench set against the outside wall of the smithy, under the shade of the overhanging thatch or perhaps an old apple tree that grew nearby. Hey, the soot that coated his skin and clothes seemed less like dirt and more like a uniform of his trade. He would wipe his hands on a rag, though they never truly came clean during the day, and then wrap his midday meal. It was simple fare, the food of a working man, a chunk of dark rye bread, dense and chewy, a wedge of hard cheese that had sweated slightly in the heat, and perhaps an onion or an apple. He would eat slowly, deliberately, cutting the cheese with a small knife he had forged himself, the blade thin and incredibly sharp. This hour was not just for eating, it was for listening. The rhythmic clang of his own hammer had filled his ears all morning, drowning out the world. Now, in the silence of the pause, the sounds of the village rushed back in. He could hear the distant laughter of children playing near the stream, the creak of a wagon wheel turning down the lane, the lowing of cattle in the distance. These were the sounds of the life he supported, the community that relied on his iron to hold their world together. Sometimes, neighbors would stop by during this break, not to ask for work, but just to talk. A farmer might lean on his scythe, wiping his brow, to complain about the lack of rain or the price of grain. The smith, often a man of few words, would nod and listen, offering a grunt of agreement or a short sentence of advice. The smithy was a natural gathering place, a neutral ground where news was exchanged along with the goods. But at midday, the talk was lazy and low, lacking the urgency of business. It was conversation for the sake of connection. The apprentice, meanwhile, might be found sitting a little ways off, perhaps skipping stones in the nearby brook or lying in the grass with his eyes closed, soaking up the brief freedom. For him, the silence of the anvil was a relief, a break from the constant demand of strike here, hold this, pump that. It was a moment to let his muscles uncoil, to let the ringing in his ears fade away. As the hour drew to a close, the smith would finish the last crumbs of his bread and take a long pull from a jug of small beer or water. He would stretch his arms overhead, his heavy shoulders cracking audibly, a sound of release. He would look at the sun, gauging the time not by a clock, but by the angle of the light on the cobblestones. There was no bell to ring him back to work, only the internal discipline of the craft. He would stand up, brushing the crumbs from his apron, and turn back toward the dark, open maw of the workshop. Stepping back inside, he would pick up the rake and disturb the sleeping coals. Crackle! The fire would wake up, blinking its orange eye. The bellows would groan as the apprentice took his station. The pause was over. The rhythm would begin again, but for that one golden hour, the world had been soft, quiet, and still. By the time the sun had begun its long slide down the sky, tilting the light into a warmer, softer gold, the blacksmith's day had already passed through many small cycles of heat and rest. The early rush of nails, the careful shoeing of a horse, the rhythmic rise and fall of the hammer on the anvil, all of it had left a pleasant ache in his shoulders and a sheen of soot on his skin. Yet in these later hours, when the shadows in the village lengthened and the sounds of the fields drifted closer on the breeze, some of his most important work often arrived at the forge door. It came not as something new to be born, but as something old to be saved. For many smiths, repairs and sharpening of battered farm tools made up a large share of their daily business, and nowhere was this more evident than in the mending of the plowshare. The plowshare was not a delicate object. It was a heavy, triangular wedge of iron or steel, designed to cut into the earth and turn it over in long, clean furrows. Yet because it went first into the soil, it also took the worst of the abuse. Stone, root, and hard clay ground against its face, rounding its once sharp edge, shaving away its point, and sometimes bending its body into a subtle but dangerous twist. When a farmer brought such a tool to the smith, he was not just bringing a piece of metal. He was carrying the memory of months spent behind a plow, the pull of the harness in his hands, and the stubborn resistance of his land. The farmer would usually set the worn plowshare down with a small grunt, the iron landing on the ground or workbench with a dull, familiar thump. For a moment, both men might simply look at it in silence. The share was often polished bright in places, not by care, but by friction, shiny where the soil had scrubbed it clean, dull where rust had crept in from neglect or damp storage. The point might be blunted back, the leading edges rounded instead of keen. In some spots, small cracks might show, like tired lines at the corners of an aging face. The blacksmith would turn the piece slowly in his hands, running thick fingers along the edge, tracing the curves and where marks as if reading a story written in metal. He could tell, just from touch, whether this was a tool that had worked mainly in stony upland fields or in softer, river-bottom soil. He might nod slightly without speaking, taking in the damage as a physician might survey a long-healed scar and a fresh bruise. The farmer, who knew the soil but not the steel, would watch for that nod as if it were a quiet promise that the plow, and his next season, could still be saved. First came cleaning. Before fire and hammer could do their work, the safest had to be freed from the clinging memory of the fields. The apprentice would carry the share to a sturdy bench or sometimes just prop it on a low wooden block outside. With a stiff brush of iron wire or bundled twigs, he would begin to scrape away the crusted mud and old plant matter, working the bristles into every crease and hollow. Dry clods flaked off and fell in small avalanches to the ground, breaking into dust that smelled faintly of far-off furrows and last year's harvest. Where rust had begun to gnaw at the metal, the scraping brought up a brownish powder, revealing the darker, moss-solid iron beneath. Sometimes the farmer would stand near, pointing out the place where the plow had started to ride too high, or the spot that always caught on a buried stone. The smith would listen with half an ear, still focused on the tool in his hands. He had heard many such stories and knew that they all came down to the same truth. The cutting edge was no longer doing its work. The plowshare had grown tired, and it needed both strength and sharpness restored. In a world where iron was too valuable to throw away lightly, mending was essential. A worn plowshare might be reforged and rebuilt several times before it was finally judged too thin to save. Once the surface was clean enough for his satisfaction, the smith would carry the share inside and lower it into the forge. Because it was a broad, thick mass of metal, it needed time to drink in the heat. He would arrange the coals carefully around it, burying the working edge in the hottest part of the fire. The bellows would begin their patient breathing once more, sending a steady stream of air into the heart of the hearth. Slowly, the dull gray iron would take on a deeper tone, a murky red that thickened and brightened as the minutes passed. While it heated, the smith prepared for the next steps. Sometimes, if the share still had enough solid thickness, he might simply draw out the worn edge, reheating sections one by one and hammering the metal back into a keener, thinner line, stretching the material like dough to restore its cutting face. At other times, when the metal had been ground and scoured too many times, there was not enough left to pull forward, and a more serious repair was needed, adding new iron to old. A narrow strip of freshest steel might be readied on a nearby hook, ready to be welded onto the tired edge like a new tooth set into a well-used jaw. In either case, the plowshare would move back and forth between fire and anvil, between orange heat and the cool solidity of the forge floor. When a section of the blade glowed at just the right shade, a rich, bright orange sliding toward yellow, the smith would hold it from the coals with long tongs and lay it across the anvil's generous face. Hey, the hammer blows were not wild or violent but carefully placed, each one aimed at coaxing the metal into a line that would both cut and endure. 4 long minutes, the only conversation in the shop was the steady cadence of iron meeting iron. The smith's strokes worked along the edge, thinning it where it had grown too fat, straightening it where it had curled. He watched not only the shape, but also the sheen of the cooling metal. The color fading from bright to dark told him when to stop and return to the fire. Over time, a new profile emerged where the old, rounded one had been, a leaner, sharper outline that promised easier passage through stubborn soil. If a strip of new steel was being added, there came a more dramatic moment, the weld. Both pieces, the old share and the new edge, were heated to the same searing temperature in the fire until their surfaces danced with tiny, momentary sparks, a sign that they were on the delicate verge of burning. Then, quickly, they were brought to the anvil and pressed together. The smith and apprentice might share the task. One held the pieces accurately in place with tongs, while the other brought the hammer down with firm, deliberate force, driving the softened surfaces into each other. On the outside, the seam might be visible for a time, a pale line where fresh iron met old, but inside, if done well, the boundary vanished. The plowshare would once again be a single, unified tool. Once the weld was certain and the new shape established, the share entered its cooling and finishing phase. The smith would allow it to drop to a dull, safer red, then turn his attention to refining the details. With lighter, more careful blows he smoothed lumps and ridges, checking as he went that the curve of the cutting edge flowed evenly from point to wing. He might pause to stand the share on end and sight down its length, looking for any slight twist that would cause it to pull the plow sideways in the furrow. His eye had been trained over years of such inspections. A farmer might not notice a small misalignment by sight alone, but his body would certainly feel it as an extra strain in the harness and an uneven cut in the field. Sometimes, to harden and strengthen the very edge that bore the brunt of the work, the smith would give it a final heat, and then quench just that part, dipping the line of the cutting face into the water trough while the thicker back of the share remained hot. Steam would rise in a gentle sheet, wrapping the lower part of the tool in a fleeting white veil, while the body of the share retained a dull warmth that allowed it to relax more slowly. The result, when done well, was a blade with a hard, wear-resistant edge and a tougher, more forgiving spine, a balance that reduced the risk of chipping on stone while still letting the plow bite cleanly into the date. At last, the plowshare would be left on a bare patch of earth or on a wooden plank to cool completely. As heat bled away into the ground and the air, the colors of the metal shifted back from faint red to mottled gray and black. Scale, thin, brittle flakes of oxidized iron, might be brushed away with one last lazy stroke of the wire brush, revealing the finished surface beneath. It did not shine like a sword. It was not meant to. Instead, it carried the dull, honest look of a tool that expected to go back into mud and stone. When the farmer returned, sometimes waiting nearby, sometimes called back from another errand, the smith would lift the share and prop it for him to see. There was no grand presentation. He might simply say, in a quiet, matter-of-fact tone, "That should take you through another season," or something equally plain. But behind those few words lived a wealth of experience, a memory of other seasons, of other plows, of years where the harvest had been good and years where it had been thin. Payment for such work might come in many forms. Sometimes coins did change hands, dull and thumb-smooth from passing through many lives. Just as often, though, the smith's work was repaid in bread, grain, meat, or promises of help at harvest time. In a small village, relationships were more like woven cloth than like single threads. The blacksmith's efforts on the plow today might be balanced, months later, when that same farmer arrived with a sack of flour milled from a field that the mended share had helped to tan. The forge was less a separate business than a beating heart in the center of the community's body. As the farmer lifted the restored plowshare, now perhaps a little heavier with fresh steel at the edge, and began the walk back toward his fields, the smith might watch him go for a few moments from the workshop door. The sinking sun would cast long shadows from man and metal alike, stretching them out along the track that led between hedges and out past the last cottages. In the distance, the land waited patiently, furrows half finished, weeds half turned, the quiet soil ready for a sharper bite. The blacksmith knew that his work would not be seen there directly. No one would stop in a field and admire a cutting edge hidden in the earth. But the even, straight lines of the plowed rows, the ease with which a horse could pull, the lack of sudden jolts when the blade met resistance, these were his signature, written in a script of earth rather than ink. Back inside the forge, the day moved on. Another tool might already be waiting, a chipped axe, a bent chisel, a broken link in a chain. The fire still glowed, though a little lower now, as if itself growing tired. The anvil's face was warm to the touch, wearing a new dusting of scale from the plowshare's restoration. The smith would take a moment to sweep the floor where fragments of old edge and flakes of weld had fallen, gathering the debris into one small, crunching pile. Even these remnants might not be entirely wasted. In some forges, the tiniest offcuts and filings were saved in a bucket, destined eventually to be melted down into something newly useful. For the listener, lying in a quiet room far from that imagined village, there is something deeply soothing in this slow story of repair. No disaster has occurred, no grand drama has unfolded, only the steady work of noticing where something has grown dull and giving it back its edge. The blacksmith does not argue with the stones in the field. He does not demand that the earth be softer or the seasons kinder. He simply meets the wear with patience, with heat and care, and sends the tool back out to do its work once more. In that gentle cycle of wearing down and being restored, many find an echo of their own days, effort followed by rest, strain followed by quiet mending. And as the imagined light in the forge fades into evening, it becomes easier, perhaps, to let the mind set down its own burdens for a while, trusting that what has been dulled by time can someday, somehow, be gently sharpened again. In the ever-present shadow of the master smith, moving like a smaller, less certain echo through the dim and soot-covered spaces of the forge, was the apprentice. He was often a boy, not yet a man, sent from his family's farm or cottage to learn the mysteries of the fire and the hammer. His presence in the workshop was both constant and nearly invisible, a quiet force that kept the daily machinery of labor running smoothly without ever drawing attention to itself. He was the hands that fetched, the feet that ran, the back that bent, and most of all, the ears that listened. His was a world defined not by speech, but by profound and watchful silence, a stillness punctuated only by the sounds of iron on iron, the hiss of the fire, and the rhythmic, breathing groan of the bellows that he operated hour after hour. The apprentice's day began long before the master's. It might be his job to rise in the cold, pre-dawn gloom, wrap himself in whatever threadbare cloak or blanket he had been given, and make his way across the frosty courtyard to fetch the first buckets of water from the village well. His shoulders would strain under the heavy wooden yoke, the water slushing over the rims with every step to splash his cold ankles and soak his shoes. He would return to the workshop and pour the water into the long trough that sat beside the forge, preparing it for the day's work ahead. Then, before the master even arrived to wake the fire, the boy would sweep the floor of yesterday's debris, small iron scales that had flaked from hot metal, charcoal dust, bits of broken clay, and other fragments that had accumulated during the previous day's labor. The straw broom made a dry, scratching sound on the packed earth, gathering the small remnants into a neat pile that would later be carried outside or, in the case of the iron fragments, saved in a bucket for future melting. The apprentice was the keeper of order, the one who ensured that every tool was in its place, that the charcoal bin was full, and that the kindling was dry and ready beside the hearth. These were the tasks of the unseen, the work that no one praised but everyone relied upon. By the time the master arrived to wake the fire, the stage was already set. The forge was ready for its performance, and the apprentice would melt into the background, becoming a living part of the shop's machinery, an extension of the master's will executed through silent obedience and careful observation. His first and most enduring duty, the one that defined his earliest years in the trade, was the operation of the bellows. For hours on end, he would stand at the side of the hearth, his hand gripping the long wooden pole, his body falling into a slow, rocking rhythm that was almost hypnotic. Pull, release, pull, release. The motion was deceptively simple, but maintaining it without pause, without losing focus, required a kind of endurance that was both physical and mental. His arm would grow tired, his shoulder would ache, his lower back would tighten from standing in the same position for so long. Yet he could not stop. The fire depended on him. The master's work depended on him. The rhythm of the entire day depended on the steady, patient breathing of the bellows, which in turn depended on the apprentice's quiet discipline. He did not pump blindly. Over months and years, he learned to read the fire's moods with increasing subtlety. He learned that the bright, roaring white heat needed for a forge weld required a fast, steady breath from the bellows, a powerful and continuous push of air that made the coals flare and dance with an almost dangerous intensity. He learned that the gentler cherry-red glow suitable for tempering a blade or forming a delicate curve needed a slower, more patient pulse, just enough air to keep the coals alive without driving them to a fury. He learned to listen to the sound of the coals themselves, the hungry roar that asked for more air, the soft, contented hiss that said the fire was balanced and happy. His work was a silent conversation with the flames, a dialogue conducted entirely through pressure and timing, a language that had no words but required complete attention and a kind of intuitive understanding that could only be gained through experience. Speech was rare in the forge, and when it did occur, it was brief and functional. The clang of the hammer and the roar of the fire made extended conversation difficult, but more than that, the work itself demanded a deep, unbroken focus that words would only interrupt. Instructions from the master were often given not in sentences, but in gestures. A slight nod of the head meant, "Moe." A sharp tap of the hammer on the anvil's face meant, "Strike now, with the sledge." A raised finger meant, "Wait." A flick of the wrist meant, "Turn the piece." The apprentice learned this language of silence until it was as natural to him as breathing. He learned to anticipate the master's needs before they were expressed. When the master pulled a long bar from the fire, the apprentice was already there with the correct tongs to help support its weight. When a tool was finished and needed quenching, he was there with the bucket or trough, the steam rising in a cloud around his face as the hot iron hissed and cooled in the water. This silence was the space in which learning happened. The apprentice learned by watching, not by asking questions or reading books. He watched the way the master's wrist would turn just so to spread the metal under the hammer, the way he would use the rounded horn of the anvil to make a perfect, smooth curve in a piece of iron that had been stubbornly straight moments before, the way he could judge the heat of the iron by a single glance at its color in the forge's gloom, knowing without thinking whether it was ready to be worked or still too cool, whether it needed another moment in the coals or was already on the edge of burning. Every movement was a lesson, every finished object a textbook written in the language of hammer and heat. The apprentice absorbed these lessons not through his ears, but through his eyes and his hands, through the slow accumulation of observations that would one day coalesce into skill. He would practice in the quiet moments, when the master was away delivering a finished piece to a customer, or during the midday pause when the fire was banked low and the shop fell into a brief, drowsy stillness. He would take a piece of scrap iron, something bent or broken that had been tossed into the corner, and heat it in the fading coals. Then, with a mixture of excitement and anxiety, he would try to replicate a simple taper, a hook, or perhaps a nail head. His first attempts were clumsy and awkward. The hammer would feel heavy and unbalanced in his hand, as if it were a foreign object that didn't quite belong to him. The blows would be uneven, landing too hard in one spot and too soft in another, leaving ugly dents and irregular surfaces in the metal. The iron would cool too fast before he could finish the shape, or he would leave it in the fire too long and burn it to a crumbling, useless crisp that fell apart under the hammer like old bread. These failures were also silent. The master might come back, pick up the lumpy, misshapen piece of iron, and simply toss it back into the scrap pile without a word. The rejection was more powerful than any scolding. It said, simply and clearly, "Not yet. Watch more. Learn more. You are not ready." There was no anger in it, no cruelty, only the plain truth of the craft. The apprentice would feel the sting of disappointment, but he would also understand that this was part of the process. Every master had once been an apprentice who had made crooked nails and lopsided hooks. The path to skill was paved with small, quiet failures that no one else would ever see or remember. But slowly, with the passing of seasons, his hands would begin to understand. The hammer would start to feel like an extension of his arm, a natural tool that responded to his intentions. He would learn the right amount of force, the right angle, the right rhythm. He would learn to read the cooling colors of the iron and move faster when needed. One day, after countless hours of practice and observation, he would forge a nail that was straight and true, with a head that was neat and centered, with a point that was sharp and even. He would leave it on the workbench for the master to find, saying nothing, but hoping silently that it would be noticed. The master might pick it up later, turn it over in his calloused fingers, and give a single, almost imperceptible nod of approval before dropping it into the barrel with the others. For the apprentice, that silent gesture would feel as loud and joyous as a peal of church bells. It was the first quiet word of praise, the first sign that he was no longer just a boy who worked the bellows and swept the floor, but someone who might, one day, become a smith in his own right. His silence was not one of submission or fear, but of observation and respect. It was a silence filled with the sounds of the forge, the hiss of steam rising from the water trough, the ringing of steel on steel, the groan of leather bellows, the whisper and crackle of the fire. It was the silence of a student absorbing a lifetime of knowledge that could not be taught with words alone, only with the slow, patient language of the hammer and the flame, only through the repetition of tasks that built muscle memory and intuition in equal measure. In this silence, the apprentice learned not just how to shape iron, but how to think like a smith, how to see the hidden possibilities in a rough bar of metal, how to plan a sequence of heats and blows that would transform raw material into something useful and beautiful. Late in the evening, when the master had left for the day and the forge was his alone for a few quiet minutes, the apprentice would perform the final tasks of closing the shop. He would sweep the floor one last time, gathering the day's debris. He would check the water in the trough and add more if needed. He would organize the tools, hanging each one back on its proper peg or rack, making sure everything was ready for the morning. And finally, he would approach the fire, which by now had burned down to a deep, sullen red glow. With a rake, he would gently cover the coals with a layer of ash, banking them for the night so that tomorrow's fire could be woken from this sleeping seed. Then, for just a moment, he might pause and look into the embers. In that soft, fading light, he might allow himself to imagine the future. A future where he was no longer the boy at the bellows, but the man at the anvil, where his own hands would shape the iron and his own voice, even if used sparingly, would carry the quiet authority of mastery. But for now, he was content to be silent, to watch, to learn, and to trust that time and patience would transform him just as surely as heat and hammer transformed the iron. While the great, thunderous work of the forge, the shaping of heavy plowshares, the turning of draft horseshoes, and the welding of wagon tires, commanded the most attention, there was another, quieter side to the blacksmith's craft. It was a domain of delicacy and precision, where the massive strength of the hammer was tamed into gentle taps, and the roaring fire was coaxed into a fine, concentrated point of heat. This was the world of small things, of household gifts and intricate necessities, where iron was made to act not like stone, but like ribbon. For the villagers, the blacksmith was more than just a mechanic of agriculture. He was the provider of the small, durable miracles that held their domestic lives together. When a door needed a hinge that would not sag, or a chest needed a latch that would keep secrets safe, they came to him. These requests often came with a shyer demeanor than the farmers with their broken plows. A woman might bring a broken pot handle, wrapped carefully in a cloth, or a young man might ask for a belt buckle, sketching the shape he wanted in the dirt of the floor. The making of these small items required a different kind of discipline. The smith had to set aside his heavy sledge and pick up the lighter hammers, tools with heads no bigger than a child's fist, polished smooth to leave no ugly marks on the metal. He would work with thinner stock, rods of iron that heated quickly and cooled even faster, demanding a rhythm that was rapid and light. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was high and musical, like rain on a tin roof, a sharp contrast to the dull thud of the heavy work. Take, for example, the forging of a simple candle holder. It began as a straight, boring rod of iron, but under the smith's hand, it became something organic. He would heat the end and gently taper it to a needle point, which would later hold the wax candle. Then, heating the middle, he would twist the metal. This was a moment of pure magic. With one end held in the vise and the other turned with a wrench, the hot iron would spiral like a stick of soft candy, the edges catching the light in a beautiful, rhythmic pattern. It was a flourish that added no strength, only beauty, a gift of art in a world of utility. Then there were the hinges. A door hinge in a medieval cottage was not hidden away. It was often a strap of iron that stretched halfway across the wood, visible to all. The smith would often end these straps in decorative shapes, a fleur-de-lis, a simple leaf, or a split curl that looked like a ram's horn. To make a leaf, he would flatten the end of the bar into a wide, thin fan. Then, using a chisel, he would gently vein the surface, cutting lines into the hot metal that mimicked the veins of a real leaf. Finally, he would curl the tip over, giving it a natural, drooping grace. When nailed to a door, it looked as if a vine of dark iron had grown there. These objects were gifts in the truest sense. They were often given as wedding presents, a set of fire irons for a new hearth, a trammel hook to hang a pot at just the right height over the flames. They were built to last not just for a lifetime, but for generations. A well-made latch would be lifted by the hands of the father, the daughter, and the grandson, each time feeling the smooth, cool surface that the smith had finished with oil and beeswax to prevent rust. For the apprentice, this was often the most accessible part of the trade to watch, though hardest to master. The sheer strength needed for the plowshare was beyond him, but the delicacy of the latch was a matter of control. He would watch how the master held his breath at the crucial moment of a bend, how he would tap the metal gently against the side of the anvil to straighten a tiny imperfection. He learned that iron could be stubborn, but it could also be playful. It could flow. There was also a special category of gifts that the smith made for himself or his trade, his tools. A blacksmith is the only craftsman who can make his own tools. If he needed a pair of tongs to hold a strange shape, he forged them. If he needed a chisel with a curved edge, he made it. This self-sufficiency gave the shop a feeling of completeness. Nothing was impossible, as long as there was iron and coal. Sometimes, on a quiet winter evening, the smith might make something purely for a child, a small iron hoop to roll with a stick, or a set of jacks made from nail cut-offs. These toys were simple, indestructible, and treasured. They were carried in pockets, slept with under pillows, and passed down. They were small, cold pieces of the forged warmth that went out into the world to be held by small hands. One of the most delicate tasks was the making of a chain. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and so every single link had to be perfect. The smith would bend a rod into an oval, scarf the ends, taper them for welding, and then heat it to white hot. Tap, tap, tap. The weld had to be invisible, smooth, and solid. Then, the next link was threaded through the first, heated, and welded. It was an endless game of linking one thing to another, a physical metaphor for the connection between the forge and the village. As the finished items cooled, they turned from gray to a rich, deep black. The smith would often treat them with beeswax while they were still warm. The wax would melt and sizzle, soaking into the pores of the metal, giving it a dark, lustrous finish that smelled of honey and smoke. It was the final blessing, a seal of protection against the damp air. When the villagers came to collect these gifts, they often ran their hands over them, surprised by how smooth iron could be. They paid, of course, but the exchange felt different than paying for a horseshoe. They were taking home a piece of art, a piece of the smith's patience. And as they walked away, the smith would turn back to his fire, his large hands ready to return to the heavy work, but his mind perhaps still tracing the delicate curve of a leaf he had left on a hinge, a secret signature of gentleness in a hard, iron world. The year in the medieval village was a great wheel that turned slowly, carrying the blacksmith and his neighbors through seasons of mud, ice, sowing, and harvest. Each turn of the wheel brought different work to the forge, but it also brought different trials. If winter was a time when the blacksmith was the envy of every shivering soul in the village, a king in his warm, glowing castle, then summer, and especially the deep, baking heat of July, was his penance. By midsummer, the sun rose early and climbed high, burning with a fierce, unblinking eye that turned the fields to dusty gold and the roads to dry, cracking ribbons of earth. Outside, the air was heavy and still, filled with the drone of insects and the smell of drying hay. But inside the smithy, the atmosphere was something else entirely. It was an oven within an oven. The stone walls, which had so kindly held the heat in January, now refused to let it go. They absorbed the sun from the outside and reflected the forge fire from the inside, creating a pocket of sweltering intensity that met the smith the moment he crossed the threshold. The work could not stop just because the mercury climbed. The harvest was approaching, the busiest time of the year for the farms, and every scythe, sickle, and wagon wheel had to be ready. So, the smith adapted. The rhythm of the shop slowed down, becoming more deliberate, more conservation-minded. Every movement was calculated to spend as little energy as possible. The blacksmith would strip down to the barest essentials of modesty. His heavy leather apron, usually worn to protect against sparks, might be swapped for a thinner, older one, or worn directly over a linen undershirt soaked in sweat. His skin, usually pale under the soot, would be flushed red, glistening in the firelight. Rivers of perspiration would cut clean tracks through the charcoal dust on his face and arms, dripping steadily from his nose and chin onto the hot iron, sizzling instantly like drops of rain on a skillet. Hiss! Hiss! Hydration was a matter of survival. In the corner of the shop, the usual jug of water was replaced by a bucket. The apprentice's main job in July often shifted from pumping the bellows to running to the well. They would drink switchel or haymaker's punch, a mixture of water, vinegar, ginger, and perhaps a little honey or molasses, to replenish the salts lost to the heat. It was tart and refreshing, cutting through the dust in their throats. The air in the shop was thick, almost chewable. It smelled of hot iron, sulfur, and the salty tang of human effort. To keep the air moving, every door and window was flung open. The smith might hang wet burlap sacks in the open doorways, hoping the evaporation would cool the breeze slightly before it entered the shop, a medieval air conditioner. The fire itself seemed different in July. In winter, it was a friend. Now, it was a caged beast. The smith stood as far back from it as his tongs would allow. He would build the fire deep and narrow, trying to keep the heat focused on the metal rather than letting it spill out into the room. When he pulled a glowing bar from the coals, the wave of radiant energy that hit him was almost physical, a solid punch of dry heat that made his skin prickle. Yet, there was a strange, drowsy beauty to these hot afternoons. The village was quiet. Most people were resting in the shade during the hottest hours. The only sounds were the lazy buzzing of flies and the rhythmic clink, clink of the hammer, slower now, as if the metal itself was lethargic. The iron seemed softer, more yielding in the ambient heat. The cooling times were longer. A horseshoe thrown on the floor would stay hot for 20 minutes, dangerous to the touch, holding onto its fire as if reluctant to return to being cold stone. When the sun finally began to dip, casting long, relief-bringing shadows across the floor, the smith would step outside. The evening air, though still warm, felt like a cool bath compared to the forge. He would peel off his apron, his tunic sticking to his back, and walk to the river or the horse trough. The sensation of cool water on his overheated skin was perhaps the greatest luxury of his life. He would sit there as the stars came out, his body tired but purged, watching the fireflies dance in the meadow, knowing that he had survived the dragon's breath for another day. If the deep, scorching heat of July was the blacksmith's trial by fire, an endurance test that left him drenched and drained at the end of every long, sweltering day, then the deep winter, especially the still, frozen heart of January and February, was his reward and his refuge. When the world outside was locked in the iron grip of ice and the wind howled around the eaves of the cottages like a living thing searching for any crack or seemed to invade, the forge became more than a workshop. It transformed into the warm, beating heart of the village, a place of light, heat, and life. It became a sanctuary. The medieval winter was not a season to be taken lightly. It was a time when survival depended on preparation, on the stores of grain laid up in the barn, the dried meat hanging in the rafters, the firewood stacked against the side of the house. In the cottages, families huddled close to their small hearths, burning whatever fuel they could afford, peat, wood, dried dung, and wrapping themselves in every blanket and hide they owned. The cold crept through the walls and up through the earthen floors, and no matter how high the fire was built, there always seemed to be a chill lurking in the corners of the room. But the forge was different. The forge had a fire that was not meant to warm soup or bake bread. It was a fire designed to melt iron. It was a roaring, powerful presence that filled the entire space with a radiant, glorious heat that could be felt from the doorway. And so, when the snow piled high and the roads became impassable, when the days were short and the nights were long and bitterly cold, the blacksmith's workshop became the most desirable place in the entire village. In the summer, the smith had thrown every door and shutter wide open, desperately seeking any breath of moving air to relieve the oppressive heat. Now, in winter, those same openings were sealed tight against the cold. A heavy woolen blanket or an old oxhide was hung over the main door, creating an airlock of sorts, a barrier that trapped the warmth inside and kept the icy drafts out. The small windows were shuttered with wooden boards, plunging the interior back into its familiar, comforting gloom, a darkness broken only by the magnificent, roaring fire in the hearth. The fire, which had been a tyrant in July, was now a benevolent king. The smith fed it generously with charcoal, not worrying about waste or conservation, because the heat it produced was not just for working the iron, it was for living. The roar of the fire was a song of defiance against the winter, a declaration that here, in this stone room, the cold had no power. The radiant heat, once a force to be endured and escaped, was now a physical pleasure, a deep, penetrating warmth that soaked into the bones and drove away the ache in the joints that always came with the frost. The nature of the work changed in winter, too. The frantic rush of the harvest season was over. The fields were fallow, buried under a thick blanket of snow, and the wagons were mostly idle, their wheels frozen into the mud where they had been left. Winter was a time for indoor work, for repairs, and for building up stock. It was a season for making the things that had been put off during the busier months, new sets of tools that would be needed in the spring, complex hinges for a new church door being built in the neighboring village, cooking tripods for households preparing for weddings, and endless barrels of nails for the spring building season. The pace was slower, more contemplative, without the pressure of immediate deadlines. But perhaps the most significant change was that the forge was no longer a solitary place. Throughout the day, especially during the coldest hours, the smith would have visitors. Not just customers arriving with work to be done, but neighbors, men from the village who came not with broken tools or requests, but simply to escape the cold of their own homes. The cottages, with their small, smoky hearths that were fed with whatever fuel could be scrounged, were often draughty and damp, the walls barely holding back the winter wind. The forge, with its massive, roaring fire and its thick stone walls, was the warmest place in the entire town. These men would arrive one by one, stamping the snow from their boots on the threshold, their breath clouding in the air until they drew close enough to the fire for the warmth to chase it away. They would peel off their heavy outer cloaks, shake the frost from their beards, and settle into the comfortable, unspoken routine of the forge. They knew where to stand, not so close to the fire that they would block the smith's work, but close enough to feel the full force of its heat on their faces and hands. They would stand there for an hour or more, turning slowly like meat on a spit, warming first their fronts and then their backs, talking of the weather, of the dwindling supply of firewood in their own homes, of sick livestock, of the latest village gossip, and of the rumors that drifted in from the wider world beyond the snow-choked roads. The rhythmic clang of the smith's hammer became the background music to their conversations. He was their host in a way, providing not ale or food, but the simple, elemental gift of warmth. He did not stop his work to entertain them. His hands were still busy with the shaping of iron, but his presence and his fire were freely given, and the men respected that. They spoke in low, unhurried voices, their words punctuated by the steady beat of the hammer, and the smith would nod or grunt in reply, adding a short comment here and there without breaking the rhythm of his work. Even the village children, bundled in layers of wool and patched linen until they looked like small, round barrels with legs, would brave the bitter cold to peek into the forge. They would stand hesitantly in the doorway, half hidden behind the heavy curtain, their noses red and their eyes wide with wonder, mesmerized by the shower of bright, golden sparks that flew from the anvil like tiny, fleeting stars. The smith might grumble at them to stand back, to stay out of the way, but there was no real heat in his voice, only the rough affection of a man who remembered being a child himself, fascinated by the magic of fire and iron. He might even, on a whim, heat a small scrap of iron until it glowed a soft orange, and bend it with a few quick taps into a simple S-hook or a twisted nail, handing it to a wide-eyed boy or girl to take home. A tiny, warm treasure to be clutched in a cold mitten, a piece of the forge to carry into the frozen world outside. The apprentice, too, felt the profound change that winter brought to the forge. In the summer, the heat had been a burden they shared equally, a trial that left both master and student exhausted and drained. In winter, it was a blessing, a gift that made every hour in the shop a pleasure rather than a punishment. He would work the bellows with renewed energy, his body warm and comfortable for once, and he would listen intently to the stories of the old men who gathered by the fire, tales of past winters, of hunts in the snow, of the great freeze decades ago when the river had frozen so solid that a fully loaded cart had been driven across it. He was no longer just an apprentice learning the technical skills of a trade. He was being woven into the living tapestry of the village, absorbing its history and its rhythms, becoming part of something larger than himself. When a true blizzard descended, sealing the village off completely from the rest of the world, the forge became an island of life and light in a sea of white chaos. The snow would pile up in great drifts against the door, and the wind would shriek and howl around the chimney. But inside, the fire roared on, the hammer sang its steady, reassuring song, and the low murmur of conversation filled the warm, smoky air. In these moments, the forge was not just a place of work. It was a promise that even in the deepest, coldest, darkest heart of winter, there was a fire that could be kept alive, a community that could gather and endure together, and a warmth that would see them all through to the spring. In every village, there were strong men who swung axes in the forest, who pushed heavy plows through stubborn soil, who hauled sacks of grain and barrels of ale until their backs ached. But the strength of the blacksmith was of a different kind. It lived not only in his shoulders or his back, broad and muscled though they were. It lived in his hands. These hands were the bridge between fire and usefulness, between glowing chaos and quiet, familiar tools. They were the last thing that touched every plowshare, every hinge, every horseshoe before it went out into the world. To watch the blacksmith at work was to witness a performance of power and violence, fire roaring, hammers crashing down, sparks flying in terrifying showers. But if you look past the drama of the heavy sledge and the glowing coals, if you look closely at the man himself, you would find the true secret of the craft. It was not just in his body, it was in his hands. If you were to look at those hands at rest, you might notice first how large they were. Broad palms, thick fingers, knuckles slightly swollen from years of gripping oak handles and iron tongs. The skin was not soft like a scribe's or merchant's. It was as tough as old leather, browned by the sun and the heat, and stained permanently with the charcoal dust that had worked its way so deeply into every pore and crease that no amount of washing could ever remove it completely. Across the knuckles and the backs of the fingers were tiny, pale marks, little crescent scars where bits of hot scale had landed and burned away before they could be brushed off, faint white traces of a lifetime spent too close to the fire. There were calluses so thick they acted as a natural glove, allowing him to pick up pieces of metal that would blister an ordinary man's skin on contact. Yet, for all their rugged, almost geological appearance, there was a kind of quiet, careful grace in the way those fingers moved, a gentleness that seemed to contradict their powerful build. When the hammer was in his grip, the true nature of those hands appeared. He did not strangle the handle or hold it in a rigid, white-knuckled fist. Instead, the wood lay in his palm like a trusted companion, fingers curled just enough to guide it, wrist loose enough that the weight of the hammerhead could swing and fall with its own momentum. Years of practice had taught him that brute force alone was never enough. Too hard a blow could split a piece of iron, driving invisible cracks deep into its heart. Too soft a blow would do nothing at all, letting the precious heat drain away before the work was done. Strength had to be married to control, and control lived in the fingertips. From the doorway, the motion might look simple, the hammer rising and falling in a steady, metronomic rhythm. Up, down, up, down. But close by, you could see the small, constant adjustments. A slight twist of the wrist to spread the metal a little more in one direction. A narrower grip to strike with the pane instead of the flat face. A sudden, almost perceptible pause as he read the bounce of the hammer off the iron, listening through his skin to what the metal was telling him. Each blow sent a shiver up the handle into his hand, a wordless message about how soft or stiff, how eager or reluctant the iron felt at that moment. His left hand, holding the tongs, was just as active and intelligent as his right. It was not merely a passive clamp holding the work in place. It was a conductor, constantly turning, tilting, and adjusting the glowing iron on the anvil face, presenting a new surface for each hammer blow. A quarter turn here, a slight angle there. These small movements were the difference between a clumsy, lumpy object and a smooth, elegant one. The dance of his two hands was a marvel of coordination, a fluid and continuous conversation that defied the clumsy appearance of the heavy tools and the raw material. He could feel the slightest vibration, the slightest shift in weight, the slightest change in resistance. His hands were not just tools to hold other tools, they were his primary sense organs. For the apprentice, watching the master's hands was the primary text of his education. He saw how the master didn't grip the hammer tightly, strangling the handle, but held it loosely, allowing it to pivot and snap at the moment of impact. He saw how the master's left hand, holding the tongs, was just as active as the right, constantly turning, tilting, and adjusting the iron on the anvil face. It was a dance of coordination that defied the clumsy appearance of the heavy tools. There was a language in those hands, too. A raised open palm meant stop. A finger pointing to a specific spot on the anvil meant strike here. A quick, chopping motion meant cut it. The apprentice learned to read these signs faster than spoken words. He learned that when the master's hand hovered over the water trough, it meant a quench was coming. When it reached for the sand bucket, a weld was being prepared. These hands were also the hands of a healer for the village. They were the hands that gently lifted a horse's hoof to check for a stone, soothing the animal with a firm, confident touch. They were the hands that mended the broken plowshare that threatened a family's harvest. They were the hands that had forged the hinges on the church door and the gate to the cemetery. In a way, the blacksmith's hands had touched every part of the village's life, from the cradle to the grave. At the end of the day, when the work was done and the gloves, if he wore them, were pulled off, the master would wash his hands in the cooling bucket. The water would turn black instantly with soot. He would scrub them with rough soap or sand, but they would never be truly clean. The iron was part of him, but as he dried them on a rag, you could see the tremors of fatigue, the slight shake in the fingers that had held 1,000 pounds of pressure that day. Yet, the next morning, those same hands would be steady again. They would pick up the hammer with the same familiarity, rake the coals with the same purpose, and begin the work anew. They were the instruments of civilization, the tools that built the tools. And in the quiet of the forge, looking at them, one could understand that true strength was not about force, but about control, endurance, and the gentle touch that could coax beauty from the hardest stone. Throughout the medieval year, the village remained largely a closed circle, a small, self-contained world bordered by the forest on one side and the fields on the other. Days bled into weeks, and weeks into seasons, with the same familiar faces appearing at the forge door. The miller, the plowman, the baker, the priest. News from the outside world arrived only in fragments, carried by the wind or the rare messenger. But every so often, usually when the roads had dried out enough to be passable in late spring or early autumn, a different kind of figure would appear on the horizon. This was the traveling peddler, a man of the road, whose arrival was always a quiet event in the life of the smithy. The peddler's cart was a marvel of mobile engineering, a rickety wooden box on 2 large wheels, piled high with sacks, bundles, and boxes, all tied down with frayed ropes. It creaked and groaned as it trundled down the village lane, a sound distinct from the heavy rumble of a farm wagon. It sounded like a collection of small, loose things rattling together. Pots against pans, tins against wood, a traveling orchestra of wares. The peddler himself walked beside it, usually leading a tired-looking donkey or pony, his boots coated in the dust of 3 counties. For the blacksmith, the peddler was not just a merchant, he was a resource. While the smith could forge almost anything from iron, he could not make the raw material itself. He depended on the charcoal burner for fuel, but for the metal, he often relied on trade. The peddler brought scrap. In the bottom of his cat, beneath the ribbons and the salt and the medicinal tonics, there was often a heavy sack of old iron, broken bits and pieces he had scavenged or traded for in towns miles away. A snapped sword blade, a worn-out cauldron leg, a bundle of bent nails from a burned-down barn. To anyone else, this was rubbish. To the smith, it was treasure. The transaction between the smith and the peddler was a ritual of slow conversation. It usually took place outside the shop, in the open air where the light was good enough to inspect the metal. The peddler would drag the heavy sack from his cart and dump the contents onto the grass with a chaotic clatter. The smith would squat down, picking through the pile with his large, blackened hands. He would tap a piece of iron against a stone to hear its ring. A clear bell-like tone meant good, solid metal. A dull thud meant cracks or impurities. He would examine the grain of a broken bar, looking for the telltale sparkle of quality steel versus the dull gray of soft iron. They would haggle, of course, but it was a gentle, low-stakes haggling. The peddler knew the smith was the only buyer for miles who had a use for this scrap. The smith knew the peddler didn't want to haul the heavy weight to the next town. They would agree on a price, perhaps a few coins, or often a trade. The smith might offer a new set of horseshoes for the peddler's pony, or a repair to the cart's axle, in exchange for the pile of scrap. But the iron was only half the exchange. The other half was news. The peddler was the medieval internet, the carrier of stories. As the smith worked on the pony's shoes or fixed the cat, the peddler would sit on the bench, drinking a cup of water, and talk. He would tell of the price of wool in the market town 2 days' ride away. He would speak of the king's soldiers seen on the high road, or of a sickness in the cattle in the next valley. He brought rumors of wars in distant lands, tales so far removed from the quiet village that they sounded like legends. The apprentice would hover nearby, pretending to sweep the courtyard but actually listening with wide ears. To a boy who had never traveled further than the nearest hill, the peddler stories were a window into a vast, exciting, and dangerous world. He heard of cities with stone walls as high as trees, of cathedrals with windows made of colored glass, of fairs where you could buy spices that smelled like heaven. The smith listened too, though with more skepticism. He knew that peddlers sold stories just as they sold ribbons, often embellishing them to make them brighter and more appealing. He would nod, grunt, and ask practical questions. Is the bridge at the river still down? Are they hiring masons at the abbey? His interest was in the mechanics of the world, not its fantasies. Sometimes, the peddler brought something specific for the smith, a special order requested months ago. A file from the city, made of harder steel than the village smith could produce. A small bag of borax for welding. Or perhaps a book, if the smith could read, or a letter from a relative who had moved away. These items were enwrapped with care, treated with a reverence reserved for things that had traveled far. The arrival of the peddler broke the monotony of the forged rhythm. It introduced a tempo of the road, a rolling, wandering cadence that contrasted with the stationary, rooted beat of the anvil. For an afternoon, the shop felt connected to the great network of trade routes that crisscrossed the kingdom. The dust on the peddler's coat was dust from elsewhere, and its presence in the clean, soot-blackened shop was a reminder that the village was just one small knot in a very large net. As evening approached, the peddler would pack up his wares. The village children, who had gathered to stare at his pony and beg for sweets, would scatter. The cart would be rehitched. The smith might offer the traveler a place to sleep in the hayloft of the barn, or the peddler might choose to camp by the stream, preferring the open sky. Watching the cart rumble away the next morning, the smith would stand in the doorway of his forge for a long moment. The road stretched out, empty again, winding into the trees and disappearing. He would feel a fleeting pang of something, not quite envy, for he loved his fire and his home, but perhaps a quiet curiosity about what lay around the bend. Then, the fire would settle in the hearth, demanding to be fed. The iron would wait to be struck. The world of the road would fade, and the world of the forge would take over once more. The peddler's visit was a ripple in the water, quickly smoothed over. But the scrap iron he left behind remained. In the days to come, that broken sword from a distant battle would be heated, folded, and beaten into a plowshare for a neighbor's field. The wandering metal would find a home, rooted in the earth of the village, its traveling days over, transformed by the master's hands into something that would stay. The end of the day in the smithy was a gradual unwinding, a slow, deliberate retreat from the high energy of noon. The last piece of iron had been laid to rest on the cooling floor. The final customer had gone, and the long, slanted rays of the setting sun now painted dusty golden stripes across the workshop. The Vespers bell might be ringing from the distant church tower, a soft, resonant call that signaled the end of labor and the beginning of rest for the entire village. For the blacksmith, this was not a time to simply drop his tools and walk away. It was a time for one of the most crucial and ancient rituals of his craft, banking the fire. The forge fire was not like the hearth in a cottage, which could be allowed to die and be relit with a tinderbox. The amount of effort, time, and precious charcoal needed to bring the deep bed of the forge up to a working heat from a cold start was immense. To do so every single morning would be an exhausting waste. And so, the fire was never truly allowed to die. Instead, it was put to sleep, carefully tucked in for the night so that its living heart could be easily revived at dawn. The process began with the bellows falling silent. The apprentice, who had been the lungs of the fire all day, would give the long pole one last gentle push and then let it hang still. The roar of air would cease, and the bright, dancing flames that had licked at the chimney would falter, shrink, and finally dissipate. What remained was the soul of the fire, a vast, deep, and intensely hot bed of glowing embers. In the deepening twilight, it pulsed with a soft, internal light, like a living creature breathing slowly. The blacksmith would take up a long-handled iron rake, a tool he might have forged himself years ago. He would approach the hearth not with the aggressive energy of the workday, but with a quiet reverence. First, he would gently push any unburnt pieces of charcoal from the edges toward the center, consolidating the heat. He was gathering the embers together, creating a dense, compact core where the heat could sustain itself for many hours. The sound was a soft, dry scrape and a gentle crunching, like walking on gravel. Next, he would begin to draw the ash over the glowing heart. Ash, the fine, gray remnant of burnt wood and coal, was a perfect insulator. It held the heat in while starving the coals of the oxygen they needed to burn away completely. He would use the rake to pull the ash from the colder edges of the hearth, creating a soft, thick blanket over the incandescent core. He worked slowly, covering the embers layer by layer. As the gray blanket thickened, the fierce red glow would dim, softening to a gentle, rosy blush seen through the veil of ash. The intense, radiating heat that had filled the workshop would recede, pulling back into the hearth until it was just a gentle warmth you could feel on your face as you stood close. For the apprentice, this was a final, crucial lesson of the day. He would watch every move, learning the proper thickness of the ash blanket. Too thin, and the coals would burn themselves out by midnight. Too thick, and the fire might be smothered entirely, leaving a cold, dead heart that would be a misery to restart in the morning. He learned to look for the breathing hole, a small, almost imperceptible spot where the master might leave the ash a little thinner, a tiny chimney that would allow a single, faint wisp of heat to escape, ensuring the fire did not suffocate. There was a profound symbolism in this act. The blacksmith was not killing the fire. He was preserving it. He was trusting that the life within the coals would survive the long, cold hours of darkness, ready to be called forth again with the dawn. It was an act of faith, a partnership with the element that was his livelihood. He was the guardian of the flame. As the fire was banked, the character of the workshop changed completely. The dancing, energetic shadows were replaced by a deep, soft gloom. The air, which had been dry and shimmering with heat, grew cool and still. The sounds of the day, the hammer, the bellows, the hiss of steam, were gone, replaced by an immense and peaceful silence. Now, the quiet sounds could be heard, the soft sigh of the wind outside the door, the settling of the roof beams, the faint, almost inaudible tick-tick of a piece of metal cooling on the floor. The smith would stand there for a moment in the near darkness, his work done. He would lean on his rake, his body finally at rest, and simply watch. He watched the last patch of red glow fade under the ash until there was nothing left but a soft, uniform gray. The workshop, which had been a place of noise and light and furious creation, was now a cave of shadows, a place of rest. The apprentice might be performing his own final ritual, checking the water troughs, perhaps topping them off for the morning, or using a damp rag to wipe down the anvil face, removing the day's scale and leaving it clean and cool for the next day's wake. These were the quiet bookends of the day, the preparation at dawn and the tidying at dusk, that held the chaotic, fiery hours of work in between. The act of banking the fire was the true end of the day. It was the moment the blacksmith finally released his control, handing the responsibility over to the embers and the ash. He had done all he could. Now, he had to trust. He would turn from the hearth, his face no longer illuminated by the fire's glow, and walk toward the door. The air outside would be cool on his skin, a welcome shock after the day's heat. He was leaving the world of iron and fire behind and re-entering the world of men, of family, of food and sleep. The fire was asleep. And soon, he would be too. When the forge fire was finally banked and the last tool had been returned to its rack, the blacksmith stepped out of the workshop and into the cool embrace of the night. The transition was always a physical shock, a sudden shift from a world of enclosed heat, sulfur, and stone to a world of infinite open space, damp earth, and starlight. For 12 hours or more, his universe had been confined to a few square yards of packed earth floor, illuminated only by the orange pulse of the coals. Now, the ceiling was gone, replaced by a vast, indigo sky scattered with the hard, bright stars of the medieval night. He would stand there for a moment just outside the door, his chest rising and falling as he drank in the air. It tasted different out here, sweet with the scent of dew-covered grass, wood smoke from distant cottage chimneys, and the faint, clean smell of the nearby stream. After breathing the heavy, metallic fumes of the shop all day, this air felt like a cool drink of water for his lungs. He would stretch his arms wide, hearing the small pops and cracks of his spine, his muscles slowly uncoiling from the hunched posture of the anvil. But there was one final ritual that had to be performed before he could truly leave the wake behind. He had to wash away the dust. A blacksmith does not just get dirty, he gets coated. The soot of the forge is a fine, greasy black powder that finds its way everywhere. It settles in the creases of the eyelids, lines the insides of the ears, and grinds itself deep into the whorls of the fingertips. It is a badge of the trade, but it is also a heavy, suffocating layer that needs to be shed. He would walk to the rain barrel that stood at the corner of the shop, or perhaps to the stone trough near the well. The water in the barrel was dark and still, reflecting the sliver of the moon. He would break the surface with his hands, the water shockingly cold against his heated skin. The first splash on his face was a moment of pure awakening. The cold water cut through the grease and the sweat, shocking his senses back to life. He would scrub his face with his rough, calloused palms, feeling the grit wash away. He would scoop up handfuls of water and rub them over his neck, his arms, and his chest, watching the water run black as it dripped onto the ground. It was a baptism of sorts, a nightly cleansing that separated the worker from the man. He would take a rough piece of linen or a scrap of old wool and scrub harder, trying to get the worst of the charcoal out of his paws. It was a futile task to get completely clean. A blacksmith always carries a shadow of his work on his skin, but the ritual was what mattered. It was a way of telling his body that the demand for strength was over. The hammer was down. The fire was asleep. Now, he could be soft again. As he washed, he would listen to the sounds of the village settling down for the night. The world was quieter now than it had been at dawn. There were no carts rattling, no shouts of vendors, just the low, rhythmic chirping of crickets, the hoot of an owl in the churchyard trees, and the occasional murmur of a voice from behind a closed shutter. Sometimes, the apprentice would join him at the trough, the two of them washing in companionable silence. The hierarchy of the shop fell away in the dark. They were just two tired men cleaning the day off their skin. The apprentice might splash water on his head, shaking it like a dog, sending droplets flying. The master might offer a grunt of amusement, a rare moment of lightness after the heavy focus of the day. Once the worst of the soot was gone, the smith would dry himself with a towel that was more gray than white, stained from 100 previous washings. He would run his wet fingers through his hair and beard, feeling the cool air dry them almost instantly. His skin felt tight and clean, tingling with the cold. He would then turn back to the shop one last time, He wasn't going back in. He was just checking. He would verify that the door was latched tight against the wind and wandering animals. He would look at the chimney to make sure no rogue sparks were flying up into the thatch. It was the habit of a man whose livelihood depended on controlling fire. He could never fully turn his back on it without one last look. Satisfied, he would turn away and begin the walk home. His cottage was likely close by, perhaps just across the yard or down the lane. As he walked, his boots crunched softly on the gravel. His gait was slower now, looser. The stiffness in his back began to ease as he moved. He wasn't marching to the rhythm of the hammer anymore. He was walking to the rhythm of his own heartbeat. He might look up at the stars again. To a medieval man, the night sky was not a void. It was a ceiling, a dome of lights placed there by God. It was a clock, a calendar, and a map. He would see the familiar constellations wheeling overhead, marking the passage of the season. The Great Bear, the Hunter, the Seven Sisters. They were the same stars that had watched over his father and his grandfather as they washed the dust from their own hands at this same trough. There was a comfort in that continuity. His life was hard, yes. It was hot, dirty, and physically punishing. But it was also simple and necessary. He knew his place in the world. He was the man who bent iron. He was the man who kept the village moving. And now, he was just a man walking home to his supper. As he reached his door, he would pause to scrape the mud from his boots. He could smell the wood smoke from his own hearth now, a gentler, domestic smell compared to the acrid coal smoke of the forge. He could smell pottage cooking, or perhaps baking bread. These were the smells of sustenance, of life being nourished rather than shaped. He would lift the latch of his home, the iron clicking softly under his thumb, a latch he had likely made himself. As the door opened, spilling warm yellow candlelight out into the blue night, he would step across the threshold. The dankness of the forge, the heat of the fire, the ring of the anvil, all of it was left behind in the night. He was clean. He was home. And the dust of the day was washed away, returning to the earth from which it came. By the time the blacksmith had washed the day's dust from his skin and stepped into his cottage, the village outside had already begun to loosen its grip on wakefulness. Lamps were being snuffed one by one, shutters latched, doors bolted. What little noise remained softened at the edges, as if wrapped in wool, a murmur of conversation behind a thin wall, the faint clatter of a pot being set aside, a sleepy child protesting that it was too early for bed. Then, slowly, even those small sounds dissolved into the thick, velvety silence of the medieval night. Sleep came quickly to a body that had lifted and swung and walked and bent from dawn to dusk. The blacksmith's pallet was simple, a low wooden frame, rope or slats, a mattress of straw that rustled when he turned. Yet after the unyielding surface of the forged stone floor and the constant standing at the anvil, it felt forgiving. He lay on his back at first, staring into the near dark, watching the last faint glow of the cottage hearth paint a dull, reddish halo on the ceiling beams. His breathing slowed. The ache in his forearms, so sharp an hour ago, blurred into a broad, distant heaviness, like thunder rumbling far away. Outside, the village exhaled as one. Dogs curled into tighter knots, their noses tucked under their tails. The last cart had rolled into its shed. Chickens had long since settled onto their roosts, heads hidden under wings. Their world shrunk to the warm circle of feathered bodies on the perch. Across the tiny cluster of homes, fire after fire sank from flame to embers. Kitchen work was over. Tools were put away. Prayers were whispered. The great wheel of the day, which had ground so loudly a few hours earlier, now turned noiselessly in the dark. Within the cottage, the blacksmith's world had narrowed to the width of his bed and the slow tide of his breath. His hands, so busy all day, lay open on the blanket, palms up, fingers curled just slightly as if still cradling an invisible hammer. The faint smell of soot still clung to his skin, but it was softened now by the cleaner scent of wool, dry rushes on the floor, and smoke from the gentle hearth. Somewhere in the shadows, a wooden spoon rested in an empty bowl. A cloak hung neatly from a peg. Boots waited by the door. These simple shapes, barely visible, were the quiet witnesses of his life. For the first time since dawn, his mind was not pulled outward by needs and demands. There was no customer at the door, no iron cooling too quickly on the anvil, no bellows to pump. Thoughts came more slowly now, drifting like leaves on a lazy stream. A half-finished hinge might flicker through his memory, or the way a horse had tossed its head when he'd lifted its foot that afternoon. But even those impressions soon blurred, sinking below the surface of sleep. The village, too, had put aside its burdens. The mill wheel was motionless, the church bell silent, the inn's rough laughter faded into memory. The stillness that followed was not empty. It was full of resting lives. Beneath every roof, people lay in various stages of sleep, some already deep in it, some hovering on the edge, some staring up into the dark the way the blacksmith had just done, waiting for their minds to loosen their hold on the day. Above them all, the same stars shone, cold, steady, and indifferent, yet strangely comforting in their sameness. In the forge, not far away, the bank fire slept as well. Under its careful blanket of ash, the coals retained just enough warmth to glow if someone were to disturb them. No one would. The anvil stood like a squat, dark monument in the center of the shop, its face cool at last. Tongs hung in neat rows from their pegs, a silent forest of iron arms. The quenching trough was still, its surface black as ink, reflecting nothing in the dark. All the charged shapes and sounds of the workday, the arcs of the hammer, the spray of sparks, the roar of the bellows, had fallen back into potential. The tools were sleeping, the fire was sleeping, the work itself was sleeping, waiting patiently for a new dawn. To a stranger arriving at this hour, the village might have looked abandoned. No movement in the lanes, no flickers of lamplight, no figures at the well. But under every roof, a small, stubborn warmth remained. A child's hand curled around a rough linen sheet. A mother's arm draped protectively over a sleeping toddler. A cat kneaded a pile of clothes once, then twice, then settled into a tight circle. Life was there, just hidden, turned inward for a few hours of healing. As the hours deepened, the village entered the kind of silence that is almost a sound in itself, a low, steady hum of nothing happening. Time thickened. The moon, if it was out, moved slowly across the sky, casting silver bars through the occasional unshuttered gap. If clouds covered it, the night became a soft, velvety blackness in which the village seemed to float like an island with no edges. In that darkness, worries shrank. Tasks, arguments, plans, all of them waited at the far edge of consciousness, unable to cross the threshold into sleep. In dreams, the blacksmith's world rearranged itself into stranger shapes. Perhaps he dreamed of iron that flowed like water, twisting itself into perfect shapes without the need of hammer or heat. Perhaps he dreamed of walking into the forge to find every tool polished and sharpened on its own, every broken thing already mended. Or perhaps he did not dream at all, dropping instead into that heavy, undisturbed sleep that working bodies sometimes earn, a blank span of time that passes in an instant, like blinking in the dark. The village dreamed with him. The miller, muscles sore from turning grain, might mutter in his sleep about sacks and stones. The shepherd might twitch as his resting mind replayed the bleat of lambs. Children rolled and sighed, their small faces smooth and unlined, far from adulthood's cares. Even the animals knew this hour and honored it. The horses standing hip-shot in their stalls, eyes half-lidded, the cows lying down in the straw, slow stomachs working, the hens on their perches, balanced and still. Somewhere far away, beyond the fields and the next line of hills, among roads the blacksmith might never walk, other forges still burned, other smiths hammered, other villages bustled. But here, in this one small circle of lightless roofs, the day had truly ended. The long chain of actions that had begun before sunrise, stirring the coals, pumping the bellows, shaping the metal, mending the tools, washing the dust, now lay cold and quiet, ready to unspool again when morning returned. Toward the horizon, the first hint of change began so subtly that no one sleeping could notice it. The stars in the east grew a fraction paler. The darkest part of the sky loosened, almost imperceptibly. Night had reached its deepest point and, without fanfare, had begun to roll away. Inside the cottage, though, nothing moved yet. The blacksmith slept on, his breathing steady, his brow smooth. He had given everything he had to the day. The hours of rest were his in full. There was a kind of perfection in this brief, fragile balance. The moment when the old day was completely gone and the new one had not yet arrived, when the fire lay dormant but not dead, when tools waited and muscles healed. In that pause, the village was as close to stillness as it could ever be while still being alive. Every life within it, every task, every worry, every joy, was threaded together by invisible lines of dependence. the farmer on the smith on the charcoal burner, the families on the fields, all of them on the turning of the seasons and the mercy of the weather. Soon enough, a rooster would crow. A dog would stay. Someone's eyes would blink open in the dark, tracking the faint suggestion of light in the window's crack. The blacksmith, too, would wake, feeling at once older and slightly renewed. He would swing his legs over the side of the bed, feel the floor under his feet, and remember, there was work to do. The embers in the forge would need coaxing, the iron would need heating, the bellows would need their slow, patient strokes. But not yet. For a few more breaths, a few more unseen heartbeats, the village remained utterly at rest, like a held note waiting to resolve. The world was poised between what had been made yesterday and what would be made tomorrow. The blacksmith, so central to the violent, transforming energy of the day, was now just another sleeping soul in a constellation of sleeping souls, equal in stillness, equal in need. And above it all, the sky watched, unchanged, as it had watched over countless generations of smiths before him, and would watch over countless more after he was gone. The tools would outlast his hands. The forge might one day serve another. The village itself might change. But the cycle, wake and rest, heat and cooling, dust and washing, waking and sleep, would continue, as steady and sure as the turning of the earth beneath his cottage floor.